On 13th of February 2008, Australia's Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologised to the indigenous people of Australia on behalf of the Australian government. He apologised for the stolen generations. He apologised for terra nullius, for the expropriation of land. He apologised for a history of discriminatory laws. And while that apology was certainly necessary, it is not sufficient. It does not reparate for the harm that was done, and it does not take the steps necessary to guarantee that it never happens again. That is precisely why a quota is needed for Indigenous Australians in Parliament. Three things in this speech. Firstly, set up a model for how this will operate. Secondly, principal claim on why we owe a reparative obligation that only this quota can fulfill. And finally, a practical argument about why this will resolve many of the largest problems facing Indigenous Australians today. What would this policy look like? We would impose a 5% quota that would be both in the House of Representatives and the Senate. So that would look like probably 8 seats in the House of Representatives and 4 in the Senate. Secondly, we would create separate seats. So in the Senate, this would function like, for example, an additional state, where all Indigenous people would be able to vote for these 4 representatives, and the usual proportional voting, a proportional representation would kick in there. In the House, we'd create geographic districts that covered large parts of Australia based on the geographic distribution of Indigenous people, giving them local MPs. Indigenous people would not vote for their state senators or their local MPs anymore. They would instead vote for these forms of representation. In every other way, this would occur similar to the election of all other federal office holders. So, for example, elections would be concurrent, and so on and so forth. Firstly, then, why is there a principal obligation for this form of reparation? We would say that this is relatively intuitive. Australia, and particularly Australia's government, has engaged in a variety of crimes against its Indigenous people. It engaged in a stolen generation, where it forcibly kidnapped people who were half Indigenous and half white, and attempted to erase their culture, to bring them up in a way in which they would not be connected to their Indigenous identity. It declared terra nullius, suggesting that Indigenous people were fauna, not humans, and it used that justification to steal their land. And until 1967, it did not even count Indigenous people in the census. It allowed for discriminatory laws to be used against them. And there are a number of other similar crimes, massacres, and forms of discrimination that we say ought to be recompensed for. So we think that generates a very strong and clear obligation on the government to repay that. Why then is this the appropriate form for that reparation to occur? 3 reasons. Firstly, we would point out that the harm that occurred was inherently a political harm. It was a denial of rights, of recognition. And so the appropriate form of recompense should be one that guarantees rights and recognition in the political realm through Parliament, the most sovereign and important body in Australia. Secondly, we would say that it's crucially important that because the harm was visited via the government, the appropriate form of reparation is to ensure that Indigenous people have sufficient control over that government to prevent those harms from reoccurring into the future. That is best achieved via a quota. But thirdly, we would say that this is the most plausible and durable form of recompense. That is to say that alternatives such as reparations in the economic sense, one, are far less likely to happen. Firstly, for the reason that voters feel the tangible cost of money far more than they do a redistribution of the way in which voting occurs, because they feel that is money that would have gone to them. It is their tax money that is being spent on people who often they lack sympathy for. Whereas, for example, this is far more abstract shifting of power. But secondly, because often the calculation of the amount of economic reparations is one that is incredibly difficult to conduct, and one in which you get many unpleasant discussions about questions of counterfactually whether or not Indigenous Australians are better off as a result of colonisation than they would have been counterfactually. Whereas it is difficult to deny the fact that the relational injustice occurred when people were subjected to discrimination, when people weren't given their dues in terms of rights. But thirdly, it is because money isn't durable in the way that political control is. Money given to people is often frittered away, particularly when it's large lump sums of money to people who are unused to holding it. For example, think about the way that lottery winners or professional athletes often end up broke despite earning large amounts of money because they're unused to being able to spend that in ways that build generational and durable wealth. Whereas a quota ensures long-term political power is vested in communities and gives them a capacity to achieve wealth via that political power and representation rather than a temporary salve that otherwise is unlikely to last. The final thing to address here is a potential claim from negative that this is an undemocratic policy. We would note, firstly, that we already constrain democracy in a number of ways. Firstly, we restrict, for example, who is eligible to run to be a politician in Australia. They have to be citizens, they have to be of sufficient age, they cannot be criminals, etc. So we recognize that there is not an absolute principle of democracy, but rather one that is already constrained in a number of facets. But secondly, we also recognize constitutional rights that overwhelm the democratic mandate, which is why, for example, Parliament is not able to pass any law it wants. It must respect the rights of individuals that we hold to be more important, which suggests that the protection of Indigenous people's rights is a more important priority than democracy, noting that this is a relatively minor infringement on the democratic process, but one that delivers very substantial principled rights to Indigenous people. Finally, then, what are the practical benefits of this policy? Firstly, it creates role models and leaders for the Indigenous community. Obviously, these people already exist in status quo, but it elevates them with a platform and exposure to the broader community and allows them to have more of a say in the way that the country is governed. But secondly, this will lead to a better discussion of Indigenous issues for four reasons. Firstly, because more Indigenous politicians will exist to raise and discuss these issues in Parliament. Secondly, because elections for these leaders will focus solely on Indigenous issues rather than Indigenous issues being merely one consideration amongst many others. But thirdly, because representation of different Indigenous perspectives can now occur. It is not just a question of, for example, the Indigenous perspective, but differing views that many different Indigenous people might have. There can be discussion of what is the best way to assist Indigenous people rather than having to fight for any consideration of Indigenous people at all. But finally, it grants Indigenous people local MPs who they can talk to, who are people who they know, who can represent them, who they can raise issues to, in a way that every other Australian has, but Indigenous people, due to geographic separation across the country, often lack. For all of those reasons, this is a morally required policy, and it's a highly effective one. Proud to propose.